Good morning again, everyone. We'll start in just a moment. I'll let the cameras and the technology be switched on to start with, so welcome back. Right. Well, good morning again, everybody, and welcome to this second lecture in the series entitled Untimely Ends, being given by our distinguished speaker, Professor John Hunter. We start this morning with a lecture entitled, I am arresting you because your ears are too big. John, please tell us about that.
All will be revealed. Right. We ended the first session by looking at some of the differences between forensic archaeology and what we might call conventional archaeology. And the first part of this session will just follow that through before we move into more uncharted waters of people with large ears. Now, just to follow up from the first session, the chain reaction that leads to a murder inquiry often starts when a person is reported missing. And most people are pretty astonished when they're told that the number of missing person reports annually in the UK is something in the order of 350,000. Now, by comparison, there are only about 600 recorded murders on average, according to Home Office figures. And of course, that doesn't mean that there are 349,400 unreported corpses lying around the countryside, merely that people tend to turn up again. And the same figure includes reporting of the same persons going missing on several occasions during the period of counting. Some, of course, will have disappeared, for example, by unreported emigration, or simply because no one bothers to report them missing. They may just have died somewhere and not been noticed. And you'd be surprised how some long-deceased individuals can lie undetected, even in populated parts of the country. Hollywood Park, not far from here, Holyrood Park, a craggy volcanic mass on the edge of Edinburgh city centre here, is visited literally by thousands of tourists every year, many of whom climb to the summit known as Arthur's Seat. Others walk their dogs or go jogging round its network of footpaths and outcrops, yet periodically someone stumbles across a body that's been there for months, or in some cases, even for years. And not far from where I live, the skeletal remains of an elderly lady known to have been suffering from dementia was discovered in the undergrowth of the central reservation of an urban dual carriageway. She'd been there for 3 years. Now, there's no strict national counting method that can account for everyone. And so the uncomfortable assumption must be there are probably more individuals murdered and concealed than are formally recorded in the stats. Now, the police tend to categorise missing persons according to perceived level of vulnerability. So to take a simple example, a 25-year-old rugby player who goes missing on tour, or a student who fails to turn up to lectures for a week, are likely to be of less police concern than a person with learning difficulties lost on the underground system in London, a toddler who goes missing from its pushchair in a busy shopping centre, or an elderly person who goes fell walking in a blizzard. And the magnitude and urgency of the police response will be commensurate with the level of assumed vulnerability of the person in question. And in the case of a child being abducted by a paedophile, the statistics show that the interval between abduction and disposal can be horrifically short, a matter of 2 or 3 hours sometimes. Hence the urgency and impact of the police response. Now, it would be inappropriate to go into the nature of this response or into the detail of its method. Suffice it to say that in many instances, especially in relation to young children, the starting point is where a child might be on the assumption that the child is still alive. And the starting point will be drawn from a mountain of statistics accrued from the recorded disappearances of other children. key factors, for example, cover the behavioural aspects of children of different ages respectively, their gender, familial relationships, and the elapsed time. And should the case develop into one of abduction and murder, there'll be other well-tested statistical criteria drawn in. For example, the place of last sighting, the person who made the last sighting, the likely distance of carriage, and potential deposition sites. And this is where archaeology enters the scene, where finding the person alive is no longer the default position. Now, Grampian police, as they used to be called, were one of the field leaders in producing search manuals for missing persons. Now, however, one of the main data sets that's used nationally is that known by its acronym called CATCHM, the Centralised Analytical Team Collating Homicide Expertise and Management. And I think you can't help but feel that the mouthful title was engineered to fit the punchy acronym rather than the other way around. In the likelihood of buried remains, which archaeology is involved, these statistics, together with intelligence and environmental factors, are normally used to decide which search techniques, or assets as they're called, can best be deployed and in what sequence. Well, the term assets draws together a panoramic assortment of terrestrial, aerial, and map-based techniques, mostly adapted from their original industrial, geological, archaeological, or military function. And in order to determine their forensic search value in the early 1990s, a few of us set up an informal organisation called the Forensic Search Advisory Group, FSAG, loosely modelled on a prototype in the United States, which aptly called itself NecroSearch International. And the latter was based in Colorado and included archaeologists, anthropologists, geophysicists, entomologists, law enforcement specialists, and others with a very impressive case history that demonstrated how well it could work. And the image here just shows some of its facets. Now, the FSAG played a similar but more restricted role. It brought together specialists in various disciplines, directing them towards the common goals of finding buried bodies, collaborating in research, and supporting police investigation. Its existence reflects how forensic archaeology was slowly beginning to move away from its conventional roots. And two of the specialist groups that it became involved with had a particular resonance with archaeology. The police search advisors, or pulsers as they were called, and dog handlers. Pulsers were formed after the 1984 bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton in an unsuccessful attempt to kill the Prime Minister by the IRA at the Conservative Party conference. Initially intended for counter-terrorism search and locating hidden explosives, these officers evolved to be just about as close to being landscape archaeologists as it was possible to be without knowing anything about archaeology. Dog handlers, additionally, added knowledge of vegetational change, soils, and scavengers using the trained olfactory senses of the dogs, either in directed free roam or by probing the ground in gridded patterns in order to release gases. And their sophistication of scent is argued to be the equivalent of detecting the contents of a bottle of gin tipped into Loch Lomond. You probably know some archaeologists who'll run them a close second on that one. We worked closely with both groups and became embedded in their training schedules. But before long, forensic archaeology became listed among the National Crime Agency's specialist areas, and archaeology became listed among those with a register of expert practitioners. So it had finally achieved forensic respectability. And my university was delighted with these contacts because it upped the institutional score on external impact. But it was less impressed when it discovered I was being sponsored by a dog food manufacturer to deliver a presentation to a dog handlers conference in Barcelona. I was the Eukanuba lecturer. Now, the other disciplines in the group, in the search community, archaeology provided one revolutionary concept. The existing perception was that search techniques should be targeted at detecting the body per se. Archaeology's contribution was to point out that even if a body had been buried 6 feet down, it wasn't necessary to dig 6 feet down to find the grave. It was much more sensible, easier, and cost-effective to look for the disturbance caused by the digging and the backfilling on or near the contemporary ground surface. Only a seriously bad archaeologist could excavate a grave and miss the body at the bottom, although it has been known. Now, bizarrely, this simple concept is one that many senior investigating officers, SIOs, had great difficulty in grasping. Skimming away the surface to find features cut into undisturbed layers is standard practice in most developer-led archaeology. And it transpired to be a successful and obvious way of eliminating as well as finding buried bodies. The majority of searches, like the 3 shown here, arose from allegations that a person had been buried in the general area of X, and the easiest method of finding the grave, or more realistically of eliminating the area, was by stripping away the surface soils. Using machines, trenching to dig the full depth in order to find the victim was very much a last resort. But having said that, there are situations, however, where conditions and equipment for search are not always optimum, and archaeology needs to be on the improvised foot, and archaeologists are very used to improvising. The situations, for example, can be quite excusable in a war zone, here in Iraq, where the only available military vehicle to strip soft sand off the desert floor was a 16-ton bulldozer. And my archaeological colleague, John Sterenberg, was the driver, and my role was to walk alongside at a low speed, and in just approaching 40 degrees of heat, concentrate on the moving 1 meter gap between the 2 tracks as the surface sand was cleared by the shovel in the few seconds before it was covered up again. Not ideal. Even less ideal and less excusable were the facilities encountered in Russia in the search for the bodies of Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich Romanov, the Russian royal family, and his private secretary. They were both shot and buried in the forests in 1918. I found it hard to believe that a country that can send astronauts to the moon was unable to supply a wide, toothless ditching bucket at 6 months' notice. But it couldn't. Now, in brief, the history of the event is this. The Duke had been exiled from the Russian royal family for marrying a commoner and was dispatched to live in the city of Perm on the western side of the Urals. That's where the red dot is on the map. Just northwest of Ekaterinburg, where the rest of the royal family was subsequently shot. He became a very popular figure and remains a figure of saint-like quality even today. As the revolution began to swing into gear, the 2 men, the Duke and his secretary, were persuaded to move to a place of safety and were taken from their apartment in Perm by carriage during the night. Now, during that journey through the forests of east of Perm, the horses failed to pull the carriage up a steep track and were obliged to get out. Realizing too late, the driver and his companion were both Bolsheviks. The Duke and his secretary tried to escape but were shot in the back and killed. According to the assassins, the bodies were hidden and then buried there the next day. Now, the track the horse took and carriage took no longer existed, but the general area could be located on the basis of several contemporary sources. But without an appropriate bucket, and with a change in water tables since 1918, the ground was virtually unworkable. But the derived strategy was simple enough. The machine ripped the pamps out of the Russian forest and then stripped away the surface layers 1 narrow-toothed bucket width at a time, with a watching brief looking for disturbances. And that brief looked for a matter of seconds before the clean surface was subsumed under slime again. Each line was then probed to release gases for the attention of the cadaver dog, and then finally scanned using ground-penetrating radar. Despite this, the track taken by the carriage was eventually found, the likely place of assassination located, but the body is still to be discovered. The ethical questions are whether one should be involved at all in an excavation so manifestly destructive and ill-equipped, whether it's important just to offer guidance to a well-intentioned exercise or simply record what happened. And dilemmas such as these become more critical, as we shall see in session 6, in the excavation of mass graves. Now, earth-moving machinery also offers the benefits of stripping large areas stratigraphically. As an example, we had cause to excavate a vast sand gravel quarry, some 100 metres in diameter, near Inverness in 2004. This was the case of Rennie McRae and her 3-year-old son Andrew, who went missing in the vicinity in 1976, shortly before the quarry went out of use. Quarry was subsequently infilled with contractors' rubbish derived from the upgrading of the A9, before being covered in earth and finally with topsoil again. In 1977, a year after they'd gone missing, it was unsystematically excavated by the police using a mechanical digger looking for the 2 missing persons. But it seems the investigation ran out of money or enthusiasm, or both, and gave up. The large hole they had made was filled in, the entire surface retopsoiled, and conifers planted. No record was made as to where the police hole had been dug or how deep it had been. Now, our own work then treated the quarry no differently to a medieval pit, but bigger. We half-sectioned it and removed the layers of infill, not with trowels and buckets, but with big boys' toys under watching brief, in the process of finding exactly where the police excavation had been in 1977. You can see that as the dark stain running from the middle. And we returned those quarry terraces and scree to exactly the same state they were in 1976, then deliberately overcut them in the process, removing an estimated 37,000 tons of infill over a period of 5 weeks. And as a result, we were able to eliminate the quarry 100% as being the place of disposal. Now, that gives some idea of the magnitude of a search area, even when a location can be pinpointed. At the other extremes are small back gardens. In one instance, the search was for an object, not a body, secreted during a major civil disturbance. This was a tenanted property, and the search required some knowledge of the dates of the individual tenancies and the extent to which those tenants altered features in the garden. This was a successful process of garden deconstruction within very narrow chronological time periods defined by the tenancies, a type of chronological precision that would be unthinkable in conventional archaeological timeframes. Now, no 2 searches are ever the same, but in the early years we persistently argued for 2 general principles to be followed on the basis of what conventional archaeology had taught us. The first, that areas that we search should have defined boundaries and starting points, finishing points, and formal records, and astonishingly, this hadn't always been the case. And secondly, that any search should progress from the non-invasive to the invasive on the basis that the more invasive the technique, the greater the potential for losing evidence. Common, straightforward, bog standard archaeology. Archaeology is, after all, a destructive process. For the former, it was only when police forces started to get to grips with cold cases that shortcomings in archiving began to be noticed. It wasn't uncommon to find disturbances in the ground which weren't graves, but which turned out to be old police diggings looking for graves. And a classic disaster came with the case of the Moors murders in the 1960s. The original search had been unsystematic and mostly unrecorded. The fact that the moorland was wild, exposed, as well as lacking reference points, and was difficult to access is unfortunate, but hardly an excuse. A revised search in the 1980s looking for a named victim, Keith Bennett, shown here, fared slightly better and took specialist advice. But it was only when a troubled SIO in the 2000s tried to pull all the bits together ahead of renewed activity that it became apparent there had been very little in the way of record keeping. No one seemed to know exactly which areas had been dug into, the size and the depth of any excavations, nor did there seem to be anything in the way of plans. Added to this, the search teams had buried all their rubbish in unrecorded locations. There was anecdotal evidence too that at the end of each day, search officers were allowed to go off and excavate a place of their own choosing, rather like some form of treat before going home for their tea. For the latter principle that we tried to enforce, moving from the non-invasive to the invasive, this depends as much on the landscape as on the SIO's confidence in there being a body there. For example, a large landscape needs to be whittled down into smaller units for detailed search. Unlike searching a small garden, which can be eliminated by using a machine, a broader landscape can never be eliminated 100% and needs to be targeted. And this is where the wider data system enters the equation. Not just the statistical data, such as the Catcham stats, but simple practical factors, geological and land use mapping, not to mention GIS attributes, intersite visibility, contours, terrain modelling, tree cover, and areas of concealment, and so forth. All these can be factored into a desktop analysis, joining new forensic disciplines such as geographical profiling and criminal psychology. And these can provide specific points of focus for targeting. And in this complex equation, archaeology is not the major player at all, merely a component in a multidisciplinary exercise. Now, the majority of murder disposals are the results of unintentional killings, where an argument gets out of hand, teaching someone a lesson goes too far, or sex goes wrong. The outcome is that a body needs to be disposed of quickly, and the necessity is for urgent concealment, where factors of geology, land use, and so on are not immediate thoughts running through an offender's mind. The tendency is for conveniency of concealment rather than for sophistication of disposal. Disposal locations, which are referred to in American literature as dump sites, are those on field edges, secluded woodland or backyards, and gardens full of clutter, as we shall see shortly, where aerial photograph is not especially useful and where geophysics is pushed to its absolute detection limits. I can pull up many examples of hurried disposals. In this one, where a victim was killed in the offender's house, in panic, the offender dismembered him, put him in 2 suitcases, which he took by taxi, before burying the parts in a relative's garden. The subsoil was a reddish colour, distinctive from the black topsoil, and readily visible when the grave, or more strictly, the disposal pit, was infilled. Another case, in fact 2 because they're connected, resonates with me for reasons that will become clear. The first involves the disposal of a teenage girl by her stepfather. He'd been forcing her into sex, and she threatened to tell her mother. My colleague and I were alerted to a badly concealed gravesite among the hills near the girl's house. It was viewed as being a crude-looking, hasty burial. We began to excavate the disturbance by half-section, and at a depth of about 40 centimetres encountered the top of something foul-smelling, wrapped in a blue material. We had been told that the girl's blue duvet cover was missing. On reporting this back to the SIO, he had the road closed, sent an officer to inform the girl's mother, asked for the pathologist to come, and the whole crime scene circus came to town, tents, cordons, and blue lights. Over the phone, the pathologist agreed that we should excavate out the other half of the grave while he drove the 30 miles or so to the scene. It was unfortunate, to say the least, that when we'd uncovered the other half, it transpired to be that of a very large dog, carefully wrapped in a blue blanket. The pathologist arrived soon afterwards and was more understanding than I thought he would be. The girl's body was eventually found in an equally hurried-looking grave a few days later. Now, some months after this, we were called out to the possible grave of another missing young woman. The disturbance was in the workplace of a potential suspect and ticked all the statistical boxes. At this point, the potential suspect had been arrested but not charged, and according to the Police and Criminal Evidence Act requirements, had been released. There was insufficient evidence against him and no body had been found. That said, the police were watching his house as we excavated. We half-sectioned, as per usual, and encountered unidentifiable remains wrapped in heavy-duty polythene. This was the point at which the SIO asked if I felt confident enough for him to tell the girl's family and call the pathologist. Under normal circumstances, I would have said yes, but mindful of recent events with a large dog, none of us wanted to be in a position for the family to be told later that it was a false alarm, even though we were 99.99% certain that the remains were human. I suggested that we waited until we recovered the whole body to be on the safe side. That was an unfortunate decision. It took an hour and a half to complete the excavation. During that time, the suspect, still under police watch, got wind of our activities on the local radio and took his own life. And I live with the fact that his death could have been prevented and that neither the family nor their daughter received justice because of that decision I took. Now, conventional archaeology doesn't play mind games like that. Now, these were all hurried disposals, but there are those which are more carefully undertaken, premeditated, killings planned in the most meticulous detail. An offender might identify a disposal location well in advance, even consider the appropriate geology, dig the grave weeks ahead, configure situations and alibis, and be forensically aware, devising both method and transport. These are the ones that pose the real intellectual challenges. But sometimes offenders try to be too clever. In one case, the offender had been careful to dig the grave in advance and deploy a storage container. He'd even separated out the different soils he'd encountered. Then, once the body was placed in, he replaced the layers in the right order, leaving a heavy clay below the topsoil at exactly the same depth as it occurred naturally. This gave the impression that the ground had never been disturbed below the topsoil itself, and I couldn't help admiring what he'd tried to do. It may have looked like natural clay, but it didn't feel like a natural clay subsoil to any archaeologist who knew his onions. And to cap it all, literally and metaphorically, his mistake was to empty a bag of soil from a different environment to cover the top of the grave, to accelerate the growth of ground cover and allow it to blend in naturally with the rest of the vegetation. As you can see, it didn't, and he's now serving life. Here's another one. This offender dug his grave on a building site through a gravel surface. To get it deep enough, he had to dig through builder's hardcore as well, but when he infilled the grave, there was only gravel in it. This meant he'd thrown out the mixed upcast and replaced it with pure gravel from a heap nearby, so that it didn't look mixed and disturbed. Clever, you might think, but clearly not clever enough. Now, one element of all this rather unsavoury journey into modern murder is to do with how murder, death and criminality are portrayed in the wider community, particularly in the news media, which tend to both satisfy and encourage the public's ghoulish appetite for sensationalism and its perception of the villain. Take, for example, the way murderers are portrayed. Any search for images of famous murderers in the press will turn up photographs such as these. And this is some rogue gallery. Dennis Nilsson, Ian Brady, Myra Hindley, John Christie, the father who beat the small boy to death in the first session. I've also added Levi Belfield, serial killer and ex-offender, convicted for the murder of Millie Dowler. Donald Nielsen, the so-called Black Panther murderer, and Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe. Now, there have to be more attractive photographs of these people, but the media feels it's obliged to use photographs that make the individuals concerned look as unpleasant as possible. A, because it gives people a reassurance that individuals who don't look like that aren't likely to murder them, and B, because it sells newspapers. Now, the perception that murderers should be evil-looking is of long standing in literature and folklore, not least in Grimm's fairy tales, which launched from early childhood the concept that evil people are nasty-looking and nice people are not. Now, today we might find that embarrassingly laughable, but it was certainly not the case in the late 19th century, when the work of the Italian Cesare Lombroso became prominent. He referred to himself as a criminal anthropologist, and who in 1876, incidentally the very year of Arthur Mitchell's first Rhind Lecture, ironically entitled The Past and the Present, published a work known as Criminal Man. Now, heavily immersed in Darwinian theory, this work had an unpleasant twist. He believed that certain individuals were not only born with criminal inclination, but that this criminal trait was evidence in their visual appearance. This would be political dynamite today, even though it's effectively what contemporary media infers with its photographs. But in Lombroso's time, such an outrageous concept was seen as a remarkable medical advance. It meant it was possible to tell from someone's appearance that they were likely to be a criminal before they'd actually committed a crime. Progress indeed. Now in France, similar theories were being voiced by Alphonse Bertillon, a police officer and anthropologist, also illustrated here. The work of both men had the effect of formally rationalizing what a growing number of medics in what we might call the mental health sector had been slowly beginning to suspect, that there was such a thing as criminal biometrics. Now in Britain, this frightening view was nowhere more virulent than in Scotland. The three main Scottish protagonists being J. Bruce Thompson, who was resident surgeon at the General Prison for Scotland in Perth, in which capacity he examined around 6,000 prisoners, and was an acknowledged authority in the then nascent discipline of criminal anthropology. Then there was Dr. David Nicholson, who became superintendent of the Criminal Lunatic Asylum at Broadmoor, and Dr. W. Wilson, who in 1869 presented a paper to the British Association entitled The Moral Imbecility of Habitual Criminals as Exemplified by Cranial Measurement. This was a study based on having measured the heads of 464 criminals, finding their average size less than that of the ordinary population, presumably meaning who were not in prison. A huge amount of research was undertaken at the time in this general field, a synthesis of which was then published in a work entitled The Criminal by a man called Dr. Havelock Ellis in 1890, which contained sketches, seen here, of inmates at Woking Prison in Surrey made by the then governor, Dr. Vans Clark, to illustrate his, that's Havelock Ellis's, points. One suspects a degree of artistic license here. Havelock Ellis, I should add, originally wished to be a teacher, but was academically unable to be a teacher, so later became a physician. Apart from his interests in criminal biometrics, and I add this as a matter of interest rather than anything else, he also published research on homosexuality, autoeroticism, and eugenics. I make no further comment on him. J. Bruce Thompson, however, wrote many papers in the Edinburgh Medical Journal in the 1860s, but the two most influential, The Psychology of Criminals, a Study, and The Hereditary Nature of Crime, were both published in the Journal of Mental Science in 1870. His memoirs, with the unnerving title of Travels in the Borderlands of Lunacy, based on his work at Perth, were published posthumously. But he was perhaps most famous for the work that he never actually carried out. He appeared in Graham McCrae Burnett's Man Booker shortlisted novel, His Bloody Project, published in 2015, where he examined the alleged multiple murderer Roderick McCrae, a peasant youth from an Aberdeenshire village. Bruce Thompson became heavily immersed in what was to be termed criminal biometrics, summarising his own studies with three main conclusions. One, there is a criminal class distinct from other civilised and criminal men. Two, that this criminal class is marked by peculiar physical and mental characteristics. And three, that the hereditary nature of crime is shown by the family histories of criminals. He wrote, the common thief or robber, or garrotter, have all a set of coarse, angular, clumsy, stupid set of features and dirty complexions. The women are all ugly in form of face and action, without the beauty of colour or grace or regularity of features, and all have a sinister and repulsive expression. Theories were now being honed and experimental work stepped up, whilst in France, Alphonse Bertillon finally proposed a system of 5 measurements that might distinguish the criminal from other people. And those were the head length, the head breadth, the length of the middle finger, the length of the left foot, and the length of the cubit, that's the tip of the middle finger, to the elbow, later to be known as the Bertillon system, illustrated here in his training guide. As an interesting aside, one of Bertillon's students was none other than Edmund Lockhart, generally hailed as being the father of forensic science. His well-known statement is in every forensic science student's mind, every contact leaves a trace. But Lockhart's views on social divisiveness were equally abhorrent as everybody else's, and his case studies in the 1920s show that superbly. Lockhart's 7-volume work, Traits of Criminals, was published between 1931 and 1935. And interestingly, a young journalist who also attended his lectures, was a man called Georges Simeon, later to become famous for the Inspector Maigret novels. And so the pieces that make up the evolution of criminalistics, the foundations of forensic science, and the crime scene fiction genre, not to mention pictures of murderers seen in contemporary newspapers, all begin to slot into historical place. Bertillon's views are quite abhorrent today, but were certainly not so in the later 19th and early 20th century. One of Sherlock Holmes's clients, in Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles, written during that period, refers to the great detective as, quote, the second highest expert in Europe after Bertillon. Praise indeed. Now, although widely used and respected, criminal biometrics were eventually discredited, thanks not least to the Edinburgh doctor T.S. Clouston, good Orkney name, based at the Edinburgh Royal Asylum. He began to argue slowly the case for social, economic and environmental factors as being significant underlying causes of criminality, although he did not entirely rule out biometrics, which continued to be used for many years. Bertillon's work survives today in only one aspect, that of the mugshot, which he devised taking full face and profile as a consistent form of facial record. Now, this perception of criminals somehow looking different is an intriguing one, and I thought it might be worthwhile seeing how far back it could be traced to see if there was a longer history of discrimination or stigma based on the person's physical appearance, and to see if there were any perceived associations with crime. I thought it might be interesting to see evidence of this in prehistory, but this assumed that visible differences will be evident from the hard tissue found from buried evidence. Worth a shot, I thought. But it transpired to be something of a challenge, given that much of the potential study material available from earlier periods was collected through grave and barrow explanations undertaken as the leisure activities by the well-heeled upper class in the 19th century. Many of these antiquarians were not noted for their curiosity in buried human remains lying among the more interesting grave goods. Human bones were clearly of secondary interest, and most of the time were of no interest at all. To give an example, in a project on the Bronze Age that Dr. Anne Woodward and I undertook some time ago, we examined 780 grave assemblages housed in museums. Much of this material had been collected by antiquarians such as Sir Richard Coldhall, Canon William Greenwell, John Mortimer, Thomas Bateman. Coldhall's interest in human material seems to have been limited to throwing it back in the hole, whereas Greenwell and Mortimer were less cavalier. Bateman kept some of the skulls, but overall, very little of the material was kept for deposition in museum collections. The images show Coldhall and Cunnington opening a barrow on Salisbury Plain, and a drawing of Bateman's rather blurred museum at Middleton by Yulegrave, with the rows of skulls at the back on shelves. In fact, of the 780 graves we examined, only 28% had anything approaching a bone report, due to the fact that only a few of the burials had been excavated according to reasonable standards, and that material had not been kept, either in whole or in part, from most of them. Now, similar problems of assemblage integrity occur in other periods, and were emphasised most dramatically by David Lawrence with respect to Neolithic material, as flagged up by Dr. Sheridan in last year's Rhind Lectures. Lawrence pointed out that, like the Bronze Age, the Neolithic was not well endowed with burial assemblages of any great number of individuals or of material in reasonable condition. Bone reports, such as they were, only began to advance to more complex pathologies than straightforward estimates of age, height, and sex in the very later part of the 20th century. This, I would like to think, was a direct result of the growth in university master's programs in physical, biological, or forensic anthropology. However, an exception to this shortfall in prehistoric data is evident in David Lawrence's reappraisal of the human remains from the chambered tomb at Isbister in Orkney. Not only do these remains cover an estimated population of 340 individuals, which is significantly larger than anywhere else, but they permitted a more detailed osteological study and pathological analysis than one restricted to simple measurement alone. The monument, excavated around 40 years ago by the late John Hedges, was popularly known as the Tomb of the Eagles. It's still privately owned, and it still markets itself under that name. But there is a comprehensive set of images and plans available on Canmore. Now, not only did Lawrence's studies enhance Chesterman's original osteological findings of 1983 with respect to the levels of presumed interpersonal violence apparent on some of the individuals, reflected in both blunt and sharp force trauma on the skull, often indicative of a violent death, but he also identified conditions that may have affected movement and speech. And these were in addition to various degenerative bone conditions indicative of hard labour. But one of the key elements that he noted among the Isbister individuals was the prevalence of cranial deformities, where there's a high level of post-bregmatic depression, sometimes ethnographically evidenced from head binding as well as other causes. And also cranioostenosis, a premature fusing of the cranial sutures, both of which might result in abnormally shaped heads. Now, irrespective of whether the condition had a congenital or an environmental base, it would almost certainly present itself in visual abnormality. In addition, intracranial pressures resulting from the condition might also generate unusual growth phenomena or create mental issues. Each or all of these may have affected how these individuals were viewed and treated by others in the same community. Now, if I have read Lawrence correctly, he asserts that on the basis of demographic evidence, the Isbister tomb population was not representative of its contemporary Neolithic society. Hence, it must have been selected for good reason. And the only common factor amongst them would appear to be visual or possible behavioural abnormalities. They were, in Lawrence's own words, diseased, crippled, limping, half-blind, abnormally formed, with difficulty in eating or speaking. Physically impaired though they may have been, we might wonder why they were selected and closeted together in death in monuments that oozed architectural ingenuity and required mammoth coordinated effect to build and maintain, when the rest of the deceased population was virtually nowhere else to be found. So were these Isbister folk special in a good sense and revered, perhaps because their abnormalities had supernatural implications, or were they special in a bad sense? Was the monumentality to keep them in, to contain them from polluting the afterlife? If so, what an effort it must have been. But either way, their physical appearance seems to have been the driver. Now, another area where human remains studies are slowly beginning to receive their potential, and for mostly the same reasons, are those from bog burials, which seem to focus on the later Bronze and early Iron Ages through northwest Europe. Here, probably one of the more famous, Graubull Man in Denmark. They tend to stand out rather, partly because they occurred in eras where cremations rather than inhumations were the norm, and partly because the popular appeal which surrounds the violent ways by which many of the victims met their fate. In fact, the fact that the combination of anaerobic conditions and tannic acid in peat bogs caused many of them to be well preserved is an added bonus to the public's appetite for the gruesome. And my former colleague Henry Chapman, who is an authority on these things, joint authored a paper published last year on their distribution. In the pre-medieval period, he identified around 50 documented bog burials throughout the UK where the remains were substantive. Roughly half contained complete or relatively complete skeletons, plus another 5 which were fleshed and substantial thanks to peat preservation. In 2011, Trevor Cowie and colleagues, using different criteria in their trawl of data, focused on Scotland and produced a total of 43 burials containing between them some 66 individuals. In their own words, the data was, I quote, largely confined to modest paragraphs tucked away in local newspapers or to passing sentences in antiquarian sources. In other words, examples unlikely to have been picked up through mainstream literature searches. Flicking through the data, it would seem that more attention had been paid to their clothing than to the human elements, of which little now remains. But one of the key outcomes from both Chapman and Cowie's research is that the number of such burials has been grossly underestimated. Many other bog burials occurred in the post-medieval period. Some of their locations are still shunned in remote highland peat cuttings, and to this day are still shrouded in folklore. A strong reminder, if ever there was one, of the terra inculta of swamps, misted fens, and the unnatural, the same traditions that encapsulate the lair of the monster Grendel in Beowulf and the treacherous marches, homes of the Hound of the Baskervilles. Bog burials were things best left alone and not spoken of, and traditions appear to be long-lasting. And all this gives some idea of disparity of data, curation and analysis, not to mention the social mores that might make them hard to study. Now, in Denmark, writing about the same time as Chapman and Cowie, Morten Raven provided a review of Danish material entitled Bog Burials in Bogs in the journal Acta Archaeologia. Although fairly summary, it addressed some of the key questions regarding whether the victims of bog burials were outcasts, sacrificial, or, to my frame of interest, bodies of executed criminals. The last of these on the basis of the prevalence of nakedness, restraints, and indications of excessive violence. Again, the evidence was archaeological rather than osteological, and ambiguous in answering many of the questions posed. Raven blamed Tacitus for over-egging tales of how Germanic peoples who committed heinous crimes were executed and disposed of, but it fits my picture rather well. There was a surge of academic publications about bog bodies during the last decade, quite distinct from the popular literature that played on the ghoulish elements. Several papers appeared in the journal Wetland Archaeology, culminating in a special edition of the journal in 2019, exclusively dedicated to the subject. In a paper that preempted this, Kristina Frendengren from Sweden examined 16 burials in the vicinity of Uppråka in Sweden, where the integrity of the buried remains was much more suited to osteological analysis. Although many of the remains were incomplete, she was able to make up a number of observations from the surviving elements, namely that the victims had all suffered from what she referred to as slow violence, commencing in childhood, culminating in direct violence which caused death, usually by trauma to the skull. This slow violence she referred to, she ascribed possible factors of malnutrition or infection, were viewed more sinisterly by Brian Sitch of the Manchester Museum as reflecting a type of grooming, it's my word, not his, as though these people may have been somehow set apart earlier in life in preparation for their eventual fate. And in an era where cremation was a predominant method of disposing of the dead, they were exceptional in being buried. Moreover, according to Frendengren, some of the bodies, or elements of them, had been altered, curated, and circulated for some time after death. They were somehow special in their own way. Interestingly, in this respect, in his work on bog bodies recovered in northwest Europe, Van der Sanden identified deformities that would have marked some of the individuals out as being distinctive from the norm. This distinction, he argues, would have been especially evident in their mobility, in their gait, in their size due to scoliosis, curvature of the spine, bone or hip deformities, dwarfism, and giantism. There's a good example in the Zavilo woman from the Netherlands, who was diagnosed as having a pathological disorder affecting both the forearms and the lower legs. It may well be that these visible manifestations of difference caused these people to be selected. Now, the word overkill has appeared in much of the later literature on bog bodies, reflecting what many see as being an unnecessary level of violence when death was finally inflicted. Lindo Mann, for example, was garroted, had his skull staved in and his throat cut, any of which on their own were likely to have killed him. Much the same applies to Tolland Man. The exact method seems to matter little. Chapman and Geary listed some of the methods that had been followed in their study of bog bodies: decapitation, disemboweling, stabbing, hanging, strangulation, slit throat, blows to the head, as well as mutilations such as cutting of the nipples, arms, and genitals. These were not nice people. The injuries are quite distinct from post-depositional damage identified during discovery and removal, and I can cite you Chapman and Geary's paper entitled Burials and the Archaeology of Pain, which covers this in some detail. So, if these victims were somehow selected, as they were at Isbister, which appears to be the general consensus, and if, like the Isbister bodies, they were not, as far as we know, representative of the contemporary population, then we have to ask what the criteria for selection were. And one rather uncomfortable suggestion but one of relevance here was that of Brian Sitch, who drew on sacrificial theory models proposed by René Girard in the 1970s. Girard, a French social anthropologist, argued that communities, in times of stress or hardship brought about by famine, war, and pandemics, I emphasize the word pandemic here for an interesting parallel, can develop a state of collective panic, focusing their wrath and energies on innocent people who, for no fault of their own, are somehow different from the rest. These differences can be physical, emotional, or behavioral. And the visible manifestation of these is what marks them out as somehow being different, but not so different that they're actually excluded from society, almost as though they were kept in the community for scapegoat purposes. Some, such as this Irish example, show the well-manicured hands of someone not accustomed to labouring, suggesting that the selection of victims may have taken place across a wide social spectrum. And when the time comes, the community collectively participates in their death like a lynch mob, all playing their part, hence the overkill, and all watching to satisfy some type of social lust. This is a communal exercise to which can be added the sacrificial element as appeasement for whatever ills had befallen the society. For example, the pandemic. Now, finally, on the bog body front, and a little uncomfortably, I draw your attention to a paper that appeared in the Society's Proceedings by Helen Bennett in 1975, entitled A Murder Victim Discovered, Clothing and Other Finds from an Early 18th Century Grave on Arnish Moor, which is in the northern Lewis. The body had been found during peat cutting in 1964 and dated to the 18th century on the basis of its clothing. It's a salutary thought that the individual was a young man who had been bludgeoned to death on the back of his head, and skeletal analysis showed that he had a deformity which would have visibly manifested itself in his mobility. Well, let me just summarize that. Whether Iron Age society identified certain types of abnormality as reflecting criminality, as Lombroso and Bertillon did, I doubt, but we can leave it open. Like their Neolithic predecessors, it diverged from their standard burial practice for groups of individuals, whose only obvious criterion for selection was that they may have looked or behaved in a manner different to the rest of their community. We can excuse both Neolithic and Iron Age cultures for hiding behind a curtain of superstition and religion in its broadest sense. We can even excuse Lombroso and Bertillon for thinking they were following science. But it hardly excuses photographs in the modern media. So what does a criminal or a murderer look like? I'm going to quote you from the late novelist Philip Kerr, who makes the following comment. It's the ordinary people, he wrote, who commit the most extraordinary crimes. It's the ladies who play a Schubert impromptu on the piano who poisons your tea. The devoted mother who smother all of their children. The bank clerks and insurance salesmen who rape and strangle their customers. And the scoutmasters who butchers their whole families with an axe. It's actually easy to recognize a murderer. It's your next door neighbor, your boss, your dentist, your doctor, the local banker. That's how they get away with it. If you want to see what a murderer looks like, look at the person sitting next to you. And how many times have we seen on television interviews with neighbours of a recently convicted murderer? Who would have believed it, they say. He was such an unassuming chap, always so polite, helped out at the local jumper sale and did his shopping at Tesco's. But to think that judging people as criminals by their appearance is no longer exists would be a huge mistake. And I want to take you back to 2010, to the Bristol area, and to the disappearance and murder of a student called Joanna Yates, who went missing on December the 17th, and whose body was discovered near a golf course on Christmas morning. The circumstances and timing gave it particular media resonance. Her landlord, a man called Christopher Jeffreys, a retired school teacher, was widely pictured on the media. In view of his unusual appearance, his long white hair, piercing eyes, expression, and his precise pronunciation, he was vilified almost instantly by the tabloid press. His phone was hacked by a national newspaper, and on the basis of public pressure, as much as any evidence that I could make out, he was arrested on suspicion of the girl's murder. The newspapers went to town on him and were eventually made to pay him substantial damages when the real murderer, a fellow student, was later charged and convicted. I leave you with a comment written in one newspaper. No one, it wrote, could look that odd and still be innocent. Nothing new there. It would seem that even our modern society, with its emphasis on political correctness and equality, has still to shake off the influences of Lombroso and Bertillon. Thank you. Thank you, Ian.
Well, John, thank you again for a wonderful, wide-ranging and interesting lecture. May I ask the audience, please, to retain their questions, as is our habit, until the end of the last session tomorrow afternoon. For the moment, we suspend our proceedings, give John a break before he has to perform twice this afternoon, and I'll ask you to reconvene promptly for 2 o'clock when we'll start again. And on that occasion, I'll remember to remind you about the fire safety exits and so on, which I'm afraid I forgot this morning. So in the meantime, we thank John again, and I look forward to seeing you at 2 o'clock.